Welcome to episode 3 in my restorative gardening series, and in today's video I'm going to be entirely focused on teaching you how to grow carrots. Now, if you haven't watched any of the previous episodes or seasons, my name is Jordan and I founded a company called Mind and Soil with the hope and intention of introducing 1 million individuals to gardening's mental health benefits. So not only am I hoping to help you grow carrots or potatoes or build this beautiful garden, but I also want to help you connect with just how peaceful, restorative, and soothing the garden can be. And so with that being said, I really encourage you to take a look back at some of the previous lessons in this series, because I've already touched on how to go about starting seeds indoors, how to build your garden plan for the season ahead, how to be growing specific crops such as potatoes or broccoli. And so there's gonna be lots of additional learnings that you can find all throughout this series. But for today, we are entirely focused on growing carrots. I'm gonna break this video down into 7 steps to grow carrots. And now I'm really excited for today's lesson because it has taken me several years to figure out how to grow carrots. I used to go about growing them and I'd always get really measly small little harvests and all sorts of crooked wonky carrots as well. But over the course of the past 3 years and running experiment after experiment, playing around with different variables, I've really figured out how to get beautiful, consistent crops of carrots coming out of my garden. And so if you follow the steps that I'm gonna walk you through in this video, I truly do believe that it's gonna save you several years of trial and error. Let me do that heavy lifting and hard work so you can just be enjoying having more time to spend growing beautiful crops in the garden. So with that being said, the very first step is planting location. And the rule of thumb on this front is that the more sun that they receive, the bigger that they'll grow. So if you want to have a really beautiful big crop of carrots this year, make sure that you allocate one of the sunniest parts of your garden to them. And this is where we run into a bit of a challenge, because it's very likely that we have more crops that we want to grow that would benefit from as much sun as possible than we do garden space. And so that might mean that you need to prioritize your carrots over some other crops, or if carrots aren't as important to you as, say, cucumbers or tomatoes, then give them those sunniest areas and you can put your carrots into a lower sun area, but just keep in mind that they won't grow quite as well as if they are in one of those sunniest spots. And so for myself, the sunniest part of my garden is against this back wall, but all of that space was already allocated to a couple of other sun-loving crops. So what I decided to do was I built a new small raised bed as far back as I could, and then filled that up with soil and used that space to plant my carrots. And as a result of giving them a really nice sunny location, I was able to get a really beautiful crop of carrots out of that bed a few months later. So with the planting location taken care of, we are able to move on to step number 2, which is to prep the soil. And I'm not gonna lie to you, what I've discovered over the last 3 years is that the way that we prep the soil for carrots is one of the most important factors in them ultimately growing incredibly well. See, the vast majority of my garden, I use a blend of 75% compost and 25% vermiculite. And this works incredibly well for some other crops such as tomatoes or cucumbers, squashes, because the vermiculite does an amazing job at retaining moisture, and those vegetables such as tomatoes, cucumbers, etc., they need tons and tons of moisture in order to be developing those fruits on the vine. They're basically entirely water, a tomato or cucumber, etc. But on the other hand, carrots, they don't need nearly as much water. And as a matter of fact, we want them to work to find that water a little bit. So if we were to utilize this blend of 75% compost and 25% vermiculite for our carrots, well, they would still grow, but they wouldn't grow nearly as well as if we were to use a soil that ultimately allows for more drainage. And the reason for this is because carrots have what's called a tap root. And what this taproot does is it basically begins to grow down into the soil and starts looking for water. And so if we plant them into a soil that retains a ton of water, that taproot doesn't need to go very far, and we're gonna end up with small, kind of stubby carrots. But if we utilize a soil that's got more drainage in it, then that taproot, it needs to go down further and further in search of water. And when it does this, we ultimately end up getting a carrot that's that's going to be much larger and much longer, and ultimately a much better harvest than what we would be getting if we were utilizing a soil that's got more moisture retention in it. So what's the best soil for growing our carrots in? And my personal preference on this front is to do a mixture of 50% compost and 50% native soil. And now if you don't have native soil available to you, then what you could do instead is 50% compost and 50% sand. And there's two ways that you can go about creating this blend of 50% compost, 50% native soil. Firstly, if you have a rototiller, then all that you need to do is basically put 6 inches of compost down on top of your native soil, be that in a raised bed or just an open field type of environment. And once you've put down those 6 inches of compost, you're then going to take your rototiller and you're going to rototill that into the top 6 inches of native soil. So now we have 6 inches of compost, 6 inches of native soil, getting mixed and blended together by that rototiller to establish that combination of 50% compost and 50% native soil. That is going to be an incredibly well-performing blend for you. Now, if you don't have a rototiller available, the other way that you can go about accomplishing this is by simply digging up buckets full of native soil somewhere in your yard that's a little bit kind of off the beaten path. And now as you do this, you're probably going to run into some rocks and some roots. Don't worry about any of that, because as you get that native soil, what I encourage you to do is to dump it out onto a sift that is about 1/2 inch in width, and then shake it on that sift. And as you do this, all the finer sand and silt and clay particles of that native soil are going to fall through into your wheelbarrow. But any of those larger pieces, such as the rocks or the roots or any pieces of wood, are ultimately not going to make it through that sift. And it's those larger pieces, such as those rocks and those roots, that our carrots would potentially run into. And when the taproot hits those, that's what ultimately kind of redirects it and results in a bit of a wonky shaped carrot. So by sifting them all out, we're ending up with a really small particle size in our native soil, and that's going to make it really easy for those carrots to grow. So now once we have sifted that out, the next thing to do in the wheelbarrow is to add equal parts of compost. So you can just kind of eyeball this, and you want to go for, again, about 50% native soil, and then add in that same amount, 50% of organic compost. And then just utilizing a shovel or a pitchfork or even your hand, go ahead and mix that up so that it's a nice and consistent mixture. And then all that you would do is take that wheelbarrow over to where you're planting, dump it into that area, and now you have your mixture of 50% compost, 50% native soil. So with the soil prepped, we're now able to move on to step number 3, which is when's the best time to plant carrots? And this is another area where I very much veer away from the conventional wisdom that you would find out there, and I take a much different approach in terms of the time frame for when I'm planting my carrots. And so to give you some background context on that, a lot of folks will actually start their carrots in and around or even a couple of weeks before their last frost. So really early on in the season. And I've tried this out and I've experimented with this, and those have resulted in some of my worst crops of carrots. Now, why is this? Well, see, those carrots that are started that early on, people do that because they will germinate and they can grow at much cooler temperatures than many other crops. So it's a kind of way to get the garden started really early on in the year. However, what this also means is that those carrots are then growing on days that are going to be much colder and much shorter in terms of hours of sunlight than in the peak of summer. And so ultimately growing in cooler conditions with less light, that's going to result in less growth being put on by these carrots. And as a result, that's why I was seeing some of those really small, really unfortunate harvests coming from my carrots when I was planting them really early on in the season. So now what I do is I start my carrots 1 month after the last frost. So for myself in zone 7B, that ends up being around May 15th. And the reason why I do this is because now the carrots are gonna germinate at a higher rate because there's warmer temperatures. And once they germinate and begin growing, they're doing so in an environment where it's much warmer and there's much longer days. And that's gonna make it that much easier for them to grow and put on tons and tons of growth. And so as a result of planting later in the season, I've been getting my absolute best crops of carrots out of the garden season after season. So I really do encourage you to experiment with planting your carrots a little bit later on in the season, or better yet, run an experiment of your own. Start one set of carrots maybe 2 weeks before your last frost, start another set of carrots right at your last frost, and then start a third set of carrots potentially a month after your last frost date. And then over the course of the season, watch and see how these carrots grow and how they compare to one another. This experimental mindset is exactly how I've learned everything that I know in the garden. And the best part about it is that it's a way more playful and fun way to go about gardening, because with every experiment that you run, you not only do get the bounty to harvest the yield, but you also get a learning that you're going to be able to take into the subsequent season. And the beauty of these learnings is that you're always excited to apply it into the next planting, and that draws you more and more into the garden, and at the same time allows you to improve and grow as a gardener with each experiment and each growing season that passes. So my big encouragement to you on this front in terms of planting time frame is to try a couple of different options so that you can see how big of a difference it makes on how well your carrots grow. So now that we know when we want to be planting our carrots into the garden, step number 4 is all focused on how to plant your carrot seeds. So let's assume for a minute that it is 1 month after your last frost, and we're right in that perfect planting window. And let's also assume that you've prepped your soil and you have that combination of 50% compost, 50% native soil in the beds in your garden ready to go. You're all set to begin planting your carrot seeds. The first thing that we need to do on this front is think through spacing. And what I like to do is square foot gardening. So utilizing something like a spacing tile, what you're going to do is make 9 divots per square foot. This is going to give each carrot a little bit of space and room for it to grow. Now, once you've created those divots, you're then going to place 3 carrot seeds into each one of the divots. And they don't need to be very deep at all. It can be nice and shallow, almost right near where the surface is. And the reason why we place 3 seeds into each of these divots is because this ensures that at least one of those 3 seeds will germinate and begin growing in that divot. And that ensures that our garden is absolutely full and stuffed with beautiful produce and vegetables coming out of it a little bit later on. So make sure that you put 3 seeds into each one of the divots. And then once the seeds are in there, all that you need to do is cover them with about 1 centimeter of worm castings. Now, the reason why we do this is because for seeds to germinate, they need to be in an environment that is both warm and moist. And worm castings do an incredible job at retaining moisture. So this is ultimately going to result in you getting a higher germination rate on your carrots, which, speaking of, carrots are notoriously slow at germinating. So it's very likely that it might end up taking you anywhere from 10 to 14 days before you see any of the carrots even beginning to sprout through the surface. And so during this time, it is critically important that the soil and that worm casting layer that we put over top of them stays moist at all times. And this could mean that you need to be out there watering 1 to 2 times per day to keep that area nice and moist for them to germinate and begin growing. And the reason why we need to be watering more outside when we're starting our seeds than inside is because it's likely that the sun is coming down, and that's going to very quickly dry up that seedling mix because of how intense the sun is. And on top of that, there's way more wind or even just natural breezes outside in the garden. And those winds and those breezes, that's also going to dry up the soil and the worm castings. So as a result of the sun and those winds that are going to come through, it's going to dry up the soil, the worm castings more quickly than if they were indoors. And as a result, you just need to be a little bit more on top of the watering when it comes to direct sowing. So if you do water 1 to 2 times per day, very confident that ultimately that soil and worm castings will stay moist, and you'll then be rewarded after about 10 to 14 days with tons of carrot babies poking through the surface. And that happens to bring us on to step number 5 for today, which is thinning and fertilizing. And so as we can see, more than one of those carrots germinated in each one of those divots that we planted, because we had 3 seeds in each one of those divots. And if we were to leave all of them in there, then what's going to happen is that their roots are going to start wrapping around one another, and that can result in them getting tangled and ultimately kind of suffocating one another, which is when we end up again with those wonky and odd shaped carrots. So to prevent that from happening, what we want to do is to thin out our carrots. And to do this, all that you're going to do is go to each one of the divots that you've planted, and where there's more than one carrot growing, you're simply going to remove the extras by pinching them and pulling them out of the soil. And so at the end of that, you're left with one carrot seedling growing in each one of those divots. And now that they don't have any competition in that area, they're going to be able to grow not only really large, but also in a really nice straight manner. And that's going to result in that beautiful harvest for you in just a couple months time. So with them now thinned out, the next thing that we want to do is we want to give them a little bit of fertilization. And what I like to do on this front is take about 1 tablespoon of 444 organic fertilizer and sprinkle that per square foot. So I just using my hori knife and I kind of sprinkle it throughout. And once I've gone ahead and applied that 1 inch to the surface, I then scratch that into the top about 1 inch or ½ inch of soil. And now over the course of the coming weeks and months, as it rains and as they're watered, that fertilizer is going to work its way down into the soil where the carrot's going to be able to put it to use and ultimately put on tons of beautiful growth for us. And folks, with that being said, we are now on to step number 6. And just before I touch on step number 6, what I do want to share with you at this time is that you've done the vast majority of the work. One of the great things about carrots is that once we get to this point, they pretty much run on autopilot, right? We don't need to be doing any pruning. We don't need to be doing any trellising. They're just going to begin to put on their growth in the garden. However, there is one thing that is really important that we do over the course of the coming months, which is step 6, and that is watering. And when it comes to watering our carrots, it's really quite straightforward as well. And ultimately, the biggest recommendation that I can make for you is to set up a DIY irrigation system. And I've got a full video on how to go about doing this. It might feel and seem a little bit daunting when you're thinking about it right now, but by the time that you've watched that video, you're going to see just how easy and straightforward it is. And ultimately, it's not going to only save you a whole bunch of time, but it's also going to ensure that each and every crop in your garden is getting the absolute right amount of water for them to grow to their fullest potential. And so once I've set up the irrigation system, all that I do is place a watering spike in where my carrots are. And then with the automatic timer, I have it set up so that it runs for 20 minutes every 2 days. And this ensures that the carrots are always watered, but it also means that they're getting a deeper watering than being watered every day. So when it comes to carrots and watering carrots, what I encourage you to think through is to water less frequently and more deeply. So don't be watering them every day because that's going to keep the water up at the surface level. Rather, water them every few days, but for a longer period of time, so that water can really work its way down into the soil. Now, if setting up an automatic irrigation system isn't an option for you, then the way that you're going to go about this is by hand watering. And so all that you need to do on this front is to grab your hose and go over to your carrot patch and then simply give them a really big drink of water. Continue watering them until that water begins to pool where the carrots are planted. Once that water starts to pool, move along to the next part of the garden that you're going to water. And as you're watering the new area, the carrots, all that water that was pooling is going to start to absorb into the soil. So continue along your kind of watering path. And then after you've done that, make your way back to your carrots. And by this time, all the water would have worked its way into the soil. And you want to do a second round exactly like the first round. So begin watering your carrots, continue to do so until that water begins to pool, and then move on to another area. The reason why we do this is because it gives it a little bit more time for that water to work its way into the soil. If we were to do just the one round and continue watering once it pools, well, the water is just gonna start flowing to the side of the beds and not actually work its way into the soil. So by doing multiple rounds, we ultimately are able to get more water into the soil more deeply so that those carrots can dig down looking for that water and ultimately put on more growth. Which brings us to our 7th and final step, which is harvesting. And what's super cool about carrots is that you can harvest them really early on or later on in the season. If you wanted to go on the early side, then you can simply harvest them and you get kind of more like snack size, small baby carrots to be enjoying. But they're super, super tasty and really nice to be munching on while you're just kind of pitter-pattering throughout the garden. Now, if you wanted to wait until kind of full maturity, then I would wait to about 100 days from when you started the seeds. After 100 days, the carrots aren't going to put on that much more growth. And on top of that, they're going to start just getting kind of woody and tough from a texture perspective. So when you get to around 100 days from the point of starting your seeds, what I like to do is basically go up to the carrot area and brush away some of that soil right where the stem is entering into the soil. And that's gonna show you kind of the diameter of the carrot. And when those carrots are about 1 inch in diameter, that's a really perfect time to be harvesting those carrots. So just give them a yank and whoo, you get to start enjoying the fruits of your labor, all the beautiful carrots that you're gonna be having coming out of your garden this season. Alrighty, so you now have all of the information that you need in order to begin growing carrots. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is just what's the variety of carrots that I've been showing you and that you've been seeing in this video. And that is the Resistifly carrot variety from my friends over at West Coast Seeds. So I've absolutely loved growing that particular variety, and two other varieties that I'd encourage you to check out and potentially try out are the Scarlet Nantes variety for a bit of a classic carrot that a lot of folks will grow, as well as the deep purple variety for a little bit of a pop of color, something fun to have in the garden there. So check out those 3 different varieties and get some of those planted for this season. But other than that, you've got everything that you need to begin. But other than that, you've now got everything that you need to be growing beautiful carrots. So with that being said, go get those hands dirty now, and I'll catch you on the next lesson. See you then.